We will discuss how public policy regarding climate change is just one of many made-up crises being used to restrict your freedom. Each person must discover for themselves the relationship between the individual and the collective. Those believing that the rights of the individual take precedent over the desires of any collective will likely achieve self-sufficiency and enjoy much freedom. Collectivists seek to diminish individual freedom, ultimately by force of law, but initially by convincing the masses to surrender their freedoms. Those surrendering freedom limit their opportunities and accept mediocre lives of varying dependency. Likely, collectivists believe that most people are not capable of self-determination, that the masses need their lives ordered, that they desire direction and find happiness when the burdens of life are transferred to a seemingly benevolent collective government. Government collectivists amplify or invent societal problems presented as crises that appear real and beyond the control of any individual, hoping to convince most that collective sacrifice of freedom is necessary and desirable to solve these manufactured crises. For decades, collectivists have controlled the reasoning skills and thoughts of the masses through control of education, the press, entertainment, and now social media. Recent actions by government to take freedoms include new IRS agents to punish independent business, FBI investigating soccer moms, social media censoring conservatives, professionals forced to vaccinate or be fired, architects not compliant with green building rules don't get commissions, government scientists not compliant with global warming dogma are defunded, and unlawful executive orders are a common occurrence now, nationally and in some states. Collectivists refine compelling arguments that freedoms must be sacrificed for what is presented as the greater good. The greater good, as determined by consumers voting daily with how they spend their dollars to live independent lives, is ignored. Freedom to make individual choices is lost when an intrusive government takes consumer dollars through taxes and fees and compels behavior. While the means and methods of eliminating freedoms are becoming more apparent, it is becoming ever more difficult to reverse their effects, with officials playing on emotions, guilt, fear, and envy. And then regulators, claiming to serve the greater good, make laws for a subdued public, trained for emotional, reactionary response. Concerns of rational citizens are disparaged. Indoctrination closes minds in some people, creating a highly partisan, bitter divide among friends with different reasoning skills. Bonds of trust are strained or broken. Doubt and suspicion replaces trust. The so-called greater good is enforced by a system of governments that collectivists control by incentivizing both elected and unelected leaders to increase regulations. Freedom becomes less affordable for the masses as the regulations are manifest. Benevolent dependency becomes an easy option for many to embrace once their opportunities for self-determination have been greatly diminished. Financial dependence on collective government reinforces learned helplessness, psychological dependence, and finally, a delusional belief that entitlements are rights. As government dependency increases, the growth of government accelerates, leading to more transfers of wealth and further losses of freedom and opportunity. On the world stage, those advocating collectivist actions are an elite nucleus with supporting outer concentric circles of people in key leadership roles. Elites work to end sovereign nations and replace them with a one-world government at the United Nations. Those in concentric circles around the elite are identified as operatives. They are aided by multitudes of common people, successfully propagandized and referred to as dupes. Propaganda is a steady drip through globalist ESG business, academia, government, the media, and big tech. The elite work through operative groups such as the World Economic Forum, the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Monetary Fund, and the Bank of International Settlements. Collectivists are continually finding ways to redistribute wealth to themselves. Those benefiting most from collectivist actions are the elite nucleus, followed by members of concentric circles of support comprised of operative leaders of the large organizations described earlier. Government is an enforcer, Top government leaders can be operatives, but are very seldom in the elite nucleus. The economic beneficiaries of collective actions are commercial interests, banks, financial services, industry, and technology. Companies with monopolies or near monopolies gain the most. Lawmakers are controlled with position, financial rewards, or they are blackmailed. Pay-to-play relationships between companies and politicians may result in lucrative government contracts. To be successful, businesses require contracts and financing, and that's most available to businesses participating in mercantilist public-private partnerships. Recent examples of crises include the COVID pandemic. Developed countries like the United States that reacted with heavy restrictions fared no better, oftentimes worse, than developed countries like Sweden that imposed few restrictions involving lockdowns, masks, and vaccines. The U.S. did beat Sweden in many categories. Per capita, we had more bankruptcies, years of school instruction lost, deaths and injuries from experimental vaccinations, and depression, but less herd immunity gained than Sweden. Developing nations in Africa, with decades of using affordable medical therapies like ivermectin, fared better than advanced nations in North America and Europe, mandating and still promoting expensive, injurious, experimental, government-subsidized vaccinations. The battle over Second Amendment rights is ongoing, where unfortunate incidents are quickly declared to be crises and are used to assault a basic right, the right to self-protection. Anti-gun advocates have backed laws to regulate guns. Those laws won't change the occurrence of incidents inflated in status for effect. Regulations sought are often nonsensical. While promoting anti-gun measures, advocates experiment with eliminating police while simultaneously releasing criminals to the streets, assuring more gun crimes and even more calls for gun restrictions. Crises are manufactured on regular intervals. They are intended to keep citizens' lives chaotic and to instill fear. The government solution to solving false crises always involves more taxes and regulations. Taxing consumers leaves them with less to spend freely and more for government to spend regulating citizens' lives. Of all the crises invented calling for a sacrifice of freedom, collectivists have enjoyed the most success with a decades-old manufactured crisis, the hoax of anthropogenic global warming. We have just discussed the goals of the globalists and the social outcomes that limit your freedom using manufactured crises. Now we'll focus on the scientific realities surrounding climate change. We will counter the constant misinformation spread by a few well-placed collectivist conspirators who have manufactured a crisis that they say requires society to sacrifice farm and forest products, mineral resources, and abundant fossil fuel energy. Climate activists believe eating meat will destroy the planet. They seek alternatives. Concerns that burning fossil fuels causes global warming has compliant public officials making policies that result in foolish bans on clean, essential fuel. A belief that humans always exploit the land in a detrimental way results in bad public lands policy. Working individuals are incentivized to manage their property wisely. Foolish laws call for deliberate neglect of public lands. Deliberately neglected forests have fueled catastrophic fires. The air and water are fouled by forest fires. Homes and habitat burn. People and animals die. How is that not more detrimental than managing lands and property? The solution is to return to private sector management of forests, contract mining, grazing on public lands that worked so well in the past. Why is a solution proven successful being suppressed? Is it because ignorance of climate science leads to irrational thought and behavior? Electric cars are soon to be mandated, with most people acting in near total ignorance of, or of no concern for, the environmental impact and cost to produce and fuel them. If the U.S. Department of Energy can mandate you drive an electric car, and a governor-appointed public utility commissioner can control the fuel for that car, then the government can control your mobility. And make no mistake, control of your mobility of freedom is the only goal in mandating electric cars. There is no environmental gain in using electricity to power vehicles. The subsidized conversion from market-preferred fuels to electricity that's labeled renewable only encourages inefficiency. It won't lessen total emissions. To build an infrastructure of wind and solar, so-called renewable energy relies on non-renewable natural resources being mined, processed, then manufactured into windmills or solar panels before being installed in energy farms. And each step along the way is only accomplished with machines that use fossil fuel energy. The current infrastructure for distribution of electricity is woefully inadequate to support the widespread use of electric vehicles. Trillions have been spent on subsidies to eliminate the use of fossil fuels, but in the last decade, fossil fuel use has only dropped from 88 to 87% of the total, while consumers' energy costs skyrocket to pay for those massive government subsidies for wind and solar energy facilities. Astrophysics explains much climate phenomena. Note the eccentricity of Earth's elliptical orbit, the black line near the bottom of this graph. And it affects temperature, which is shown in red, and ice volumes, shown in gray. High eccentricity coincides with ice ages approximately 100,000 years apart. Volcanic dust, in purple, shows that volcanic activity precedes a rise in CO2, and that is expressed in parts per million and shown in yellow. Currently, Earth's orbit has minimal eccentricity, producing a climate optimum temperature. North polar insolation, expressed as illumination per square meter, which is the top blue line, it trends cooling, while total ice volumes rise and fall with global steady temperature, again at approximate 100,000-year intervals. 90% of Earth's ice is in Antarctica and is growing slowly. Ice is receding slightly in the northern latitudes. The varying volume of total atmosphere is indicated in brown. Historic climate data was derived from analyzing ice core samples from both Antarctica and Greenland. Samples taken in Antarctica show that Earth has witnessed a deep ice age winter about every 100,000 years, interrupted by short warming periods. Then, from samples taken in Greenland, we see data which shows Earth recovering from the last ice age 12,000 years ago. Earth has enjoyed the Holocene climate optimum for a relatively short 10,000 years. The climate optimum is expected to continue for about another 10,000 years. The climate optimum has supported a sharp rise in human population in the last 5,000 years, while global average steady temperature, GAST, has gradually cooled 2 degrees centigrade in the last 3,500 years. In absolute terms, world hunger has never been lower than today, even lower than just 2 centuries ago. Michael Mann's hockey stick is at the far right end of this graph. Michael Mann graphed the hockey stick, shown as the blue line, with incorrect data from the medieval warming period and without historical context in order to mislead the uneducated. The red line graphs the correct data. Michael Mann heads climate study at Penn State University. His work is heavily subsidized by the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which spends tens of billions of your dollars each year to promote the incorrect premise that Earth is suffering a climate crisis. Many Earth temperature phenomena are related to the changing conditions of the sun. The graph shows variations in sun activity over the last 500 years. The sun's energy is created when hydrogen fuses to create helium. The sun radiates electromagnetic waves of energy. Amplified sunspot activity coincides with the variations in polar insolation, the energy received by Earth at its highest north and south latitudes. The sun is currently trending toward a cooling minimum, similar to the Maunder minimum experienced in the 17th century. From 1970 to 1990, natural phenomena caused atmospheric CO2 to increase from 280 parts per million to 420 parts per million. And just for perspective, humans exhale 40,000 parts per million. Sailors and submarines breathe air of 5,000 parts per million. In 1991, just one volcano, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, spewed more CO2 than the entire human race has produced in all the years on Earth. In 2022, there were 80 volcanic eruptions. The IPCC ran 102 computer models based on the premise that the increase in atmospheric CO2 levels would cause an increase in global average steady temperature. When rising CO2 didn't produce a rise in gas, those IPCC computer models proved the IPCC premise to be incorrect. But please understand, that wasn't their intention. The IPCC promoted another incorrect premise, that a rise in CO2 levels was due to human activity and not volcanoes. But humans can only affect about 1/800th of the total atmospheric CO2 produced. Combining these incorrect assumptions, the United Nations IPCC officials led the call for humans to end the use of fossil fuels. When their computer models produced inconvenient results, the IPCC tried to cover up those results, and in 2009 they were caught in what will always be remembered as ClimateGate. After that, phenomena the IPCC previously labeled global warming were given a new label, climate change. The UN IPCC admitted to the cover-up, symbolically fired their leader at East Anglia University, but have never acknowledged that they were wrong about the relationship of CO2 levels and gas. In recent years, IPCC reporting stations were added in the Northern Hemisphere and removed in the Southern Hemisphere to skew temperature collection data. The Northern Hemisphere has twice the land mass, as does the Southern Hemisphere. Lands inhabited by humans typically record higher temperatures than do the oceans. The IPCC in 2022, after propagandizing an entire generation of students, in a 400-page paper authored by 4,000 in-house scientists, including the Michael Mann team, repeated their incorrect assertion that rising CO2 levels increased gas. Those incorrect assertions once again falsely tie human activity to CO2 levels and call for an end to the use of fossil fuels. Recently, the UN IPCC, highlighting the higher, though beneficial, CO2 levels, are confused in their quest to place blame for its production. While calling for lower levels of human-generated CO2 in North America and Europe, but not in Asia, the United Nations ignores studies and trends, perhaps revealing its plan to sabotage the economies of sovereign democracies. Most new human-generated CO2 comes from Asia, and even if humans could significantly affect the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, would we want to? Proponents of reduced CO2 levels have never quantified their ideal goal in parts per million. If anyone knows the perfect level of CO2, please name that number, and while you're at it, what's the cost to achieve that number? Climate activists tell us to reduce CO2 emissions, but they don't use numbers because they have no idea what the goal should be or what it would cost to get there. CO2 levels today are consistent with historic levels, and they're not alarming. Satellite images show increased CO2 levels occurring between 1970 and 1990 have increased vegetation 17%, doing much to alleviate world hunger, even as world populations increase and more food is required. Between the warm El Nino year, 1998, and the year 2012, there was no rise in global average steady temperature. During that interval, sea level rose 3.2 millimeters, and that's just a little over a quarter of an inch. Yes, Earth has warmed in the last century, and yes, sea levels have risen in the last century. Hopefully you have a new understanding of why neither are happening at an alarming rate, and why each is expected to reverse in future millennia. Maybe for better, maybe not. You have just been shown why astrophysicists believe Earth is in a pattern leading to a winter period several thousand years from now. Meanwhile, human populations will continue to prosper with abundant food supplies in this Holocene climate optimum that supports life for 1.4 million interdependent species in nature that continually adapt. While the Earth's climate has never looked better, we can't say the same for typical human understanding of climate science. Einstein said only two things are infinite, the universe and human stupidity, confessing he wasn't really sure about the universe. Scientific minds welcome criticism of their work. Inviting critical commentary hastens the discovery of truths they seek. Closed minds, claiming the science is settled, fear a search for truth. If you discover you've been duped about climate science, please be truthful with yourself and courageous in self-correcting your actions. Unless there's a sincere determination to reverse trends in education, to educate young and old alike towards competency and not just compliance, we will witness many in society devolving into increased manipulation of their lives, bringing a further loss of freedom not just to those accepting compliance, but to all of us. Positive education would include unaltered science, economics, and history, a healthy skepticism of government, and a return to teaching the Constitution and civics would accompany positive education. Critical thinking skills by open-minded individuals, not dogmatic collective dictates, would guide the unaltered application of learned skills in a free and functioning society.